Hello and welcome to The Public Good. This is Deja James with Partnership for the Public Good, or PPG, uniting over 380 organizations trying to make a better Buffalo Niagara region. We do policy and advocacy work. We're in the height of our community agenda process where all 380 of our partner organizations, from grassroots groups, block clubs, to service organizations, and as well as universities, are able to come together and vote in a collaborative process to create policy agendas for our year. This year, we have a video about the Community Agenda 2025. Make sure you check that out. It is in a previous episode where I had my executive director, Andrea O'Sullivan, talking about our community agenda for this year. But not only do we do the community agenda, we do this wonderful show here called The Public Good, where we're able to talk about not just policy items, but also other initiatives, thoughts, research around different issues and our current political times. And that's really what I want to focus about on here today. And I'm so excited to have Dr. Rinaldo Walcott here with me today, who is the chair of the Africana and American Studies Department with the University at Buffalo. And I really want us to have a discussion about what the role of that huge title is, and especially in the current political climate we're here now. The role of academia, the role of Africana studies, what can we be learning from that, and all those other things. But before we get into all the nitty gritty of that very deep conversation, I want you to just introduce yourself to folks, to let people know where you're from and the kind of the context of how you ended up here in Buffalo with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
First, thank you for having me on the show. I'm really excited to get into it with you. Yeah, so as you said, my name is Rinaldo Walcott, and I'm a professor in the Department of Africana and American Studies at UB. I'm the chair of department, and I hold the Carl V. Granger Chair in Africana and American Studies. I arrived in Buffalo about literally 2 years and 2 months ago.
Okay.
In January 2023. And I was recruited to come to UB and head up the department, which had recently gone through a new incarnation. I think in about 2020, UB decided to reinvest in its Africana Studies department, and it brought along American Studies with it. So we're interesting hybrid of Black Studies and American Studies, but we actually think it makes sense. So it's an exciting and interesting moment at UB right now for Black Studies.
I love how there's that bridge between Africana and American Studies, because the root of American Studies, it can't not include that, right? And so I think that's a really interesting bridge. And I noticed when I was looking at your title to make sure I got it right, that was there. And I said, oh, that's different. It's not Africana American Studies, Africana and American Studies, both together, which when I went to college was very much two separate departments. So how has that collaboration and kind of that bridging gone? How do you see that right now?
Yeah, make no bones about it. There are tensions. But of course, at UB, our Africana Studies is diasporic and transnational. So we're very much interested, and we begin from what happens in the US and even what happens very locally in Buffalo and what happens in Erie County. But then we're really interested in Black people's lives as they connect and differ globally, nationally, globally, regionally. So I have colleagues who work on Africa. I have colleagues who work on Mississippi. I have colleagues who work on Black Canada. I have colleagues who are interested in Black Europe. And all of that work coalesces around the kinds of experiences that Black people share globally, the kinds of ways in which Black people get positioned in nation states globally. And that brings us to American Studies, because of course the US is not just its geography, but the US is its empire, and the US impacts other places and other spaces. So we have students from China who are studying the US. We've had students from Japan who are studying the US. But we are also interested in how the US has a formulation. What's the word I'm looking for here? The US has a formulation how it encounters blackness, not just black people living in the U.S., but black people living elsewhere. How does the U.S. travel as an idea, as a set of practices, as bodies moving through the world? So our department is dedicated to studying all of that and fostering communities of people who want to study, engage, think, dialogue around those kinds of concerns and questions.
I love that you bring up kind of the diasporic nature of the work that you're doing there at the Africana and American Studies Department, because, especially in times right now where the hegemonic power of the US is really a major talking point in every country around the world right now because of our leader, I will say. It's interesting to think about not only the domestic impacts of, racism, of difference, of hate, of all these different trends that we're seeing kind of proliferate our systems that kind of have always been there in the undertone, which I think is probably what Africana studies talks about. But, where it's so in the forefront now where people can call out fascism or call out racism or call out whatever these things are in a declarative way that I think Black people have been doing continuously and haven't stopped. But, and I think in past years we've been called alarmist for kind of calls of that nature. And so now, because of this political time, do you find it's more difficult to have these conversations, or are people more open to listen to that kind of research and work because of the times we're in?
I I think it's still being worked out.
Okay.
I think the way in which you put it, that black people have always been dealing with these kinds of questions and concerns and issues and violences and the brutality that shapes so many of our experiences. And then we have called it what it is: fascism, anti black racism, authoritarianism, and so on. We've been accused of being, as you said, alarmist, or we've been told, hold on, things are changing. Um, we've been told, don't rush things, it takes time. And of course, much of what we have experienced and continue to experience and will likely experience at even more intensified levels, it's now bearing down on others. Will those others turn to us for some kind of understanding of how we might survive the moment? I'm not sure. But indeed, that led me, I was asked by my colleagues at the Humanities Institute at UB to organize their annual conference this year. And the theme that we chose for the annual conference, that I chose for the annual conference, I should say, is Black Studies and the Crises of Our Moment. And the reason I chose that is because I think Black people have, unfortunately, a very long history of dealing with a crisis after crisis within crises, and
Mm-hmm.
so on. And so I think, the work of Black studies, Africana studies, has been to think about crisis, has been to think about catastrophe, has been to think about the kinds of really difficult contexts that sometimes people are asked to live their lives under. And I think that, in the field of Africana studies, we've done a tremendous job of figuring out how to live and survive crises, but how to also think them beyond the individual self, how to think them as ways to make new forms of community, how to think them as ways of refashioning ourselves, how to challenge ourselves to come to new kinds of political positions and imaginaries. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about those kinds of things at the conference from March 12th to March 13th.
That's amazing. I love that you're creating a space for kind of us to ideate and create space to talk about how we've already been fighting back, but how can we be reutilizing some of those tools? I think that I've seen some of that on the grassroots level. I've seen a couple boycotts and some different things, and people are reflecting back to Montgomery bus boycotts and all these other things. But because we're in a little bit of a new age, we also need to refresh and create new tools a little bit. But I also feel like a lot of our people have been disconnected from their history in a way, and there's kind of a targeted, purposeful, you know, attack on Black studies and this threat of um, trying to take it out of schools, to there's like this convoluted argument of Black studies somehow is creating insecure hate towards young white Americans or making insecurities with them and things like that. But how I think what you're doing here with this event is kind of doing the subversive idea of, no, actually, Black people have something to say about this moment that's actually helpful to all of us, not just within the Black context, but to us all. And how can we be uplifting the work that Black people have been doing to a more national and international type of level? And you come over from a really interesting perspective, because I hope you don't mind that we had a previous conversation before this, so bear with me, y'all watchers. But you reference how you kind of hail from Canada, right? And so I was really interested in that after we had our discussion, because I'm always interested in Black people from other places, and so being Canadian and kind of being able to be on the outside looking at America in a different way than just from inside. What do you think African Americans do have to say for the rest of the world? But also, what do you think the role is as Black people from other countries in terms of what fights you have had, what you have added to the movement as well? Because I think that a lot of movement-based ideas in the Black world are from the African American perspective, but what other perspectives, I'm interested internationally, do you feel are missing from that conversation?
That's a great question, and you said a lot.
Yeah.
But I wanna go back to one thing that you said, because I don't want to miss it.
Okay.
Which is the kind of question of the work that Black Studies does.
Yeah.
In terms of education.
Yeah.
Black people are probably the most aware people that education is a double-edged sword. That education can be tremendously fulfilling and enlightening and even liberatory, but that education could also confine you. And the work of Black Studies has been to always point to the ways in which education works to lock us into conditions of unfreedom. When Black Studies is at its best, it opens up an arena for us to think about what living a life could really mean. It opens up powerful arenas for thinking about the unfinished projects of freedom, not just for Black people, for everyone. So Black Studies engages with that double-edged sword of education by doing a lot of work to overturn the lies of knowledge that can keep people trapped in positions of subjugation and unfreedom. And Black Studies, as we know, formally and institutionally, began at San Francisco State here in the U.S. in '68. So globally, anywhere that people do Black Studies, we owe Black people, activist Black people in the U.S., we owe them for that.
Okay.
For bringing Black Studies in its most radical forms inside the institution of the university and then outwards again. That's important to note, and that's important to tarry with. And for me, in my own work, I track the lives of Black people globally, whether in Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, Canada, where I've lived most of my life, but I was born in Barbados in the Caribbean. And one of the things that's like really important to acknowledge, it's not so much the kind of question of how a certain kind of capitalized Blackness from the US circulates globally.
Yeah.
That's a given, and there's very little we can do about that. But what's not a given and what doesn't get talked about enough are all of the ways in which African American politics and African American political personalities have been, for over 150 years or more, engaged in transnational forms of solidarity with other Black people around the world. That Black people around the world have engaged in struggle with African Americans, as African Americans have engaged in struggle with other Black people around the world, as a way of recognizing that Black people find themselves wherever they are located in common conditions, in similar conditions, and that our fight is a global fight. It's not just bound to a national space. In the current moment of social media, I'm sure you've probably seen it and heard the phrase diaspora wars.
Yep.
One of the things that has been so absolutely frustrating about diaspora wars is the manner in which so many people come to misunderstand what it means to be a Black person in the world, and the ways in which some people cleave to claiming the nation state, as a Black people cleave to claiming what we can only call the narcissism of minor differences, as though they're the full story of who and what they are. And so, I'm less interested in how people are claim a nation state, and I'm more interested in what are the kinds of social conditions that we must struggle against, so that all of us can live the lives that we actually deserve to live.
That's so interesting to me because I think and I love how you brought up your your Caribbean roots, because for me I come from a family of Cuban immigrants, and so I've always looked at Blackness just a little bit different as growing up, and I felt like there was this struggle of, you know, do I claim my Cubanness over my Americanness? Because I found that that's what my family did. And it felt just like a coping mechanism. Like we're distancing ourselves from kind of the egregious history of being an African American in the United States. And somehow our Caribbean ancestry is better. And once I really learned what was going on in the Caribbean during slavery, I said, well, why are we more proud of that? I mean, and so either way, and my family trying to make sure I kept my language, and we really honor wanting to make sure Spanish is maintained. And I said, either way, when I really thought about it, it's still a colonizer language, right? And so the material, like you said, existence of even my ancestors being Black in Cuba in the past and present is really no materially better than what we have going on. And so how are we thinking about that in terms of commonality and struggle, and how we should be moving forward, rather than, oh, well, no, this is my flag and I'm separate than this over here. And, I see that a lot. I mainly see it between, Black people from the UK and American, and then as well as Africans and African Americans. And there's that distance there. And a lot of the time, I have a colleague at work who's from Africa, who's Congolese, and we have this discussion a lot, Regine and I, about how we can bridge our communities together, because when we really talk about it, a lot of things have maintained, a lot of African American traditions, they've really maintained. We have that root, we still have that, but it's almost as if all of us, we're kind of this lost people, right? And so I feel like people are coping and trying to cling to nationality or certain customs post colonization.
Again, this is where education becomes really important. I mean, you can see or encounter people in those conversations. They might have degrees, they might have completed high school, but they have like really fundamental misunderstandings of what constitutes culture, of what constitutes cultural practice, of what constitutes cultural expression, of the longevity of African retentions in the Americas, of of the changing nature of cultural life on the African continent. No one group is static, and of course, part of Black people's survival in the Americas, and it was to hold on to some of what was not lost on the slave ship, some of what was not lost in the encounter with Europeans, in the encounter with other African beings. So, we created things in the Americas. Yeah. Like we didn't just walk off the ships and held on to everything that came with us in our heads from Africa. there was commingling and co-mixing, and new inventions happened, but some things retained. And similarly, on the continent, people mixed and changed things too,
Right.
and so on. And so, I mean, the vernacular way of saying it is like, we just got dropped off at different islands, but there's something more profound than that, which is to say that none of those things can fully contain who we are, that there's always something more. And there's also something that we don't fully understand, that we can't fully access, that we can't fully name, that we can't fully make sense of. But it's there, it shapes us, and it gives us a sense of connection. And so I think a lot of those diaspora wars, a lot of that is a kind of disappointment in misrecognition. That we so desire to recognize each other. And when that recognition fails, it turns into a kind of anger, when really it should be a point of conversation about why it failed. What is it that we might have lost or that we're still not capable yet of accessing, that we can't put into language? And what does it mean to live with that?
Mm. It's we're just having such a conversation. I feel like I'm digesting myself of even the way I approach, the work and liberation and the fight, right? I've always challenged myself in how we're fighting against each other when like we're not the common enemy. Like let's
Even though there
refocus
are
here.
some enemies in our community
There
who
are.
will sell us out, who will put us back on the ships.
Well, there were some then and there's some now, right? I
Exactly.
mean, that's gonna be what it is. And also not everybody wants to go the same place. I think like there's always this misconception that all Black people have the same destination, that freedom and liberation means the same thing to us all. And it doesn't at the end of the day. And we have disagreements on that. And that's a whole other debate on what it should be, what it is now, and all those other things. But I love the way you kind of counter the diasporic war into a sentiment of we just want to be seen by each other, and we're frustrated because those pieces aren't always fitting, and that desire of belonging and community and camaraderie that sometimes works, and when it works it's so beautiful. Like you have this, it just feels so good, and to that counter of when it fails, it really is. It is angering in a certain type of way, and you feel betrayed. I think you feel a sense of betrayal that then creates this kind of vitriol that possibly is misplaced, and as you said, should become a different conversation. And I hope that we can have some of those conversations, and even within our community. I mean, there's issues between men and women, and then the LGBT community and everyone else, and all of these other conversations. And what has the role been of Black LGBTQ people in the fight for liberation, and how have they been recognized? How have they not? And different things of that nature. And that's something that I'm learning more about now. But there's so much, to your point, that goes into Black studies that kind of informs so many other areas of thought. And so to that end, I want to go back to something that you said, talking about your event of Crises, and how not only is our fight for liberation kind of our own and something that can help us, but it can help others in other communities. And there's also been solidarity between Black people and Palestinians, say, or people in the Middle East, or other kind of, oppressed peoples, right? And so how can we be not only fighting for us in this time? And I mean, I think at a certain point, it's one of those, you got to kind of put your own seatbelt on or whatever. You have to put your own mask on before you can help other people, right? But how can we be thinking about our liberation fight in terms of others, even when they maybe don't accept it? But what is the role of kind of Black liberation in the fight for overall liberation from capitalism, from racism as a whole, not just anti-Black, but for other communities of color and things like that? And should we have solidarity with those other communities? Because I think that's a debate also sometimes, at times.
at times. You know, you will recall that in the most recent movement for Black Lives, BLM, that one of the slogans went something like, "None of us are free until all of us are free."
Yep.
And the struggle for Black freedom, for Black liberation, is a struggle to free this world. Um, I don't say that to make Black struggle exceptional. I say that because it's rooted in certain kind of rude or vulgar reality that everywhere we look in the world, even in putatively Black nations, Black people are at the bottom of the rung, right? Black people are suffering the most alongside indigenous peoples if we're talking about North America and some other parts of the world. But it's Black people, and we have to be really clear minded about that. So we know that at any point in the existence of this world, this planet, if Black people say we feel free, other people are going to be really free too. Um, and so that's just a kind of philosophical, a very basic philosophical position that I begin with and from. On the question of solidarity, of course, Black people have to be in solidarity with other oppressed peoples around the world. We understand the systems that keep people oppressed. And again, Black life has been foundational to those systems. Transatlantic slavery didn't just take freedom or produce the conditions of unfreedom for Black people. It turned Black people into units of labor and commodities that became the foundation of the kind of brutal, unequal distribution of material resources and effective resources that we now live with. So Black people are integral to the late modern world that we live in and that we share with others. And so our liberation breaks all of that apart. Our liberation is um, something like, if we are free, an entirely new order of life has come into existence. And so we fight for that liberation alongside others who share that goal of remaking how we relate to each other across now what we call race and class and gender and sexuality and so on. But we don't do that so that we can become the new dominators. Mm. We do that because we understand the stakes of unfreedom. We understand the ongoing, what it means to live in sometimes a fast and sometimes a slow genocide. So of course we look to Palestine and we see what happened after October the 3rd, after October the 7th, 2023. And we identify, we do more than identify. We stand next to the Palestinian. But of course we look to Palestine and we also see Black Palestinians. Mm-hmm. Of course we look around the world. There's no place around this globe where Blackness doesn't show up. Mm-hmm. And as I said, and often when it does show up, it's at the lowest rung of the society. So that, the kind of conditions that we want to be able to have disappear from how we cohabit this planet. Black people are at the forefront of attempting to make those conditions recede, disappear, so that full lives can be lived by people. And if we have to do that in coalition, we will do that in coalition until the coalition doesn't work anymore. Mm-hmm. And we will stand in solidarity with other people because, for lack of a better language now, we have a righteous response to what we think is justice.
To that end of that baseline philosophy of if we're free, then everyone's free, do you feel like the current political climate of trying to repress Black liberation movements and I mean, it's always been, but I think, everyone's talked about this transition post-Obama era of a kind of retaliation, of a rubber banding back, right? Of a retraction, of a regression, of a cycle, whatever people want to call it, of, oh no, we got to rein this in, right? do you feel like that white supremacy, that hegemonic type of power, is responding to, oh, if they make progress, our whole system is going to be upended. And so, therefore, we need to stamp this out, right? So, do you feel like where we're at now is in response? Do you agree with that kind of analysis of our current time, that right now, especially the thread on Black studies, of talking about the reality of how this country was made and its true history, and acknowledging that being some sort of threat, is that in response to that baseline philosophy of, if we really get into that, the whole system's going to come crumbling down, and we can't have that? Do you think that's the base of it?
That is definitely one significant and weighty element of it. There are others. Um, Capitalism in its most vicious, late modern form is also collapsing for white people. And as W.E.B. Du Bois said, the wages of whiteness that many white people need to be able to rely on, they can't rely on anymore. Their whiteness is not paying them what they thought it would pay them. So we've got all of these. That's why the conference is called the crises, as in plural. We've got all these crises. We've got crises in Black communities. We've got crises of Blackness as it encounters white supremacy. We've got crises of whiteness. We've got crises of class. We've got crises of sexuality and gender. And they're all coming together to produce an understanding of the brutality of the social relations of capitalism. And Black people have a massive role to play in that. And Africana studies and Black studies has been revealing that for a very, very long time. Since the 70s, Black scholars and thinkers in South Africa and North America have been using the language of racial capitalism to talk about capitalism. So even when Black activists, Black intellectuals get together with white leftists and other leftists, we have had to adjust that language by pointing to the racialized nature of the forces that oppress us. So Blackness plays a profound role in what future might come, and therefore we're going to see a large part of the attack coming towards us. But that's something that we have almost 500 years of dealing with.
Yeah.
And we have survived. Of course, we pay a significant price. I don't want survival to be heralded as some kind of heroic thing. Who wants to survive under these ongoing brutal conditions? But we have survived, and we have produced adjustments to the ongoing brutalities. And because some of those adjustments have been really profound, yes, there's a significant pushback that specifically targets us. And this takes us back then to your question about solidarity. This is why we will sometimes have to and must do our work alongside others. Because we can be specifically targeted, but when we're specifically targeted, it's because the possibilities that our struggle have opened up for more than us. It threatens to overthrow the entire system. And at that point, of course, the system, once it's still holding the reins of power, will respond. And it does.
That's so interesting, too, that you point out, even in quote unquote progressive spaces, we still have to kind of identify the specific racialized components. And I've definitely experienced that even in my own work of, hold on, you guys are missing a perspective here, and we need to make sure this is included, or what are we really doing here, right? And, you know, I think especially now it's easy to just scapegoat, oh, it's the right, that is doing all these things, that this, once we fix that, everything's going to be okay. And I'm saying, no, in the center, on the left, I've seen some things, we have to address this too, right? And it also then goes into our community as well, because even intra-community, we have some things that we we got to sort out a little bit here.
Patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia.
Yeah.
But on all those things are not shared just by our community, and the right didn't just arrive at the moment that it's in because they overwhelmed everyone.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who were soft to their other seductions.
Because they agreed.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, there were some
Exactly.
talking points that some of our community said, well, yeah, maybe I can get with that part,
Yeah.
and it's about, what parts of your identity can you sacrifice for others, for, some of us do have certain privileges or whatever, and what are the layers of that, and what are those intersectionalities. I love this conversation that we're having, by the way. I'm just like so excited about it. um I want to invite others, and I don't know if your event is completely open to the public, but I just want to make sure that other people have a chance to kind of have this kind of discussion, inform with you, inform with your colleagues, inform with whoever else you're in community with. Um, how do you see, the role that you're playing within an academic setting somehow? How are we getting this out to the community at large? Where do we have, in your opinion, these conversations of, we do need to talk about Black patriarchy. We do need to talk about homophobia within our community. How do we start to have those discussions with each other, and then therefore with others?
Yeah. First thing, let me say that if people want to come to the conference who are not members of the UB community, they're absolutely invited. They can go to the University at Buffalo website, find the Humanities Institute webpage, find current events, find the annual conference. It will say Black Studies and the Crises of Our Moment, and right underneath you're going to see a register button. All you got to do is register and show up. It's free and open to the public, and the colleagues who are coming from Canada, and the U.S. will be more than pleased to have community members participate in the conversations after the presentations that are made and so on. On the kind of question, I mean, the work of Black Studies is to open up these conversations. The work of Black Studies is to take the risk to say something, to speak into the gaps, to open up the difficult terrain of what it means to make community. That community is made out of struggle. Um, I, I sit here with you. I'm a Black queer man. I'm a Black gay man. I identify as a Black gay man. Um, that shapes how I make sense of the world. It's not the only thing about me that shapes how I make sense of the world. I'm also a Marxist. I'm still committed to an idea of communism. I think that after the fall of the wall in 1989, that leftists have taken a terrible retreat, and that capitalism has emerged as though it's the only way to organize human life, and that we need more people who are willing to come with their inventive ideas for how we can organize human life in ways that are not brutal and eviscerating as late capitalism has been. So all of that informs how I come to the question of Black life. I focus on Black life because I'm a Black person, and because I think, you know, as I've been accused by some others who disagree with me, I think there's something special about Black people. I think there's something unique about those of us who are the descendants of the people who survived transatlantic slavery. Um, we are our ancestors were the people who fueled this edifice of brutal capitalism, their bodies, their labor, their ideas, their inventions. And and I think that we have a responsibility to provide a different account of what that has meant. That the white supremacist triumphant account of their civilization is not the only account that matters. And so, Black Studies has continually done the work to overthrow that account. So something a little bit more honest might show up. And I think that that's what's really always at stake. That even when we have the intramural conversation inside Black communities about patriarchy or sexism or transphobia or queerphobia or what have you. You know, the impossibility of having serious and sustained conversations about sex and sexual practice in Black communities and so on, that those are not disconnected from everything else that's going on around us. Even as we might be reviled by the larger society, we're still a part of it. And so how we move intramurally and extramurally shapes what the present and the future.
And I think I couldn't say anything else after that. I think that's really the summary of our show, the importance of your event. Make sure everyone check out, I'm going to make sure it's linked, Black Studies in the Crisis of Our Time. Please check out the Humanities page for University at Buffalo, and also keep an eye out for more programming from the Africana and American Studies Department from the University at Buffalo. Thank you so much, Ronaldo, for having this conversation with me today, and for our viewers. I think this is going to be kind of memorialized onto YouTube and the internet. So hopefully this conversation for years and years to come informs people who are maybe just now approaching these type of discussions and trying to figure out, what are my thoughts about it? How do I navigate this type of space? And I think you gave a very, very great starting point for some people to be starting to be introspective and think differently about how they're approaching life and what privileges they may or may not have. So I just thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. This has been The Public Good with Deja James from Partnership for the Public Good, or PPG, uniting over 380 organizations to create a better Buffalo and Niagara region and the world, as we talked about today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you again next week.